merciful Savior, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Why? The answer is that the nation is full of atheists. Why? The answer is that this is punishment for the atrocities that they committed in the last century. Why? The answer is what makes me safe. Why? The answer is what reminds me that because I am not like them, what happened to them will not happen to me. Why? The answer is what gives me confidence that they were in control of their destiny, and so I am in control of mine. That there is order in the world, that life makes sense, that people get what they deserve. Why? The answer is something that we seek when any disaster happens. And as we watch the scenes unfold in Japan, the answer is even more dangerous because we can't say that they weren't prepared. We can't say that they weren't expecting earthquakes and tsunamis. In humanity's epic quest to protect ourselves against earthquakes and tsunamis, Japan is our fearless leader. Japan is where all humanity's newest technologies, earthquake-proof architecture, giant tsunami walls, nationwide drills have been in place for years. Japan was the most prepared place on the planet. The hard truth is that over a week ago, the natural world attacked humanity at our strongest, most reinforced position, and it still brought us to our knees. We have lost thousands in the battle, and we have trembled on the verge of a greater catastrophe. Now, I'm sure in the coming years, people will search for things that they could have done better, precautions that they could have taken better, and that's okay. But in the end, we are still faced with the nagging feeling that our best just isn't good enough. That technology and planning and drilling and building and all the other heights of human achievement will never really save us. That our flesh in the end is, as our ancestors suspected, fragile, hopelessly mortal. Period. Our flesh is fragile. Even with reinforced cement and tsunami walls, our flesh is fragile. Even with no-fly lists and full-body scanners, our flesh is fragile. Even with proper nutrition and antioxidant teas, our flesh is fragile. Even with 401ks and the best insurance policies money can buy, our flesh is fragile. The lesson of the week. The universe is chaotic. Our flesh is fragile, and we will never save ourselves. So, what do we do with that? A perfectly natural reaction to that would be to hunker down, to build up our survivalist food supply and hoard our ammunition. A perfectly natural reaction to that would be to run as fast as we can away from every fire, small or disastrous. But in every disaster, there are always those of us humans who inexplicably, unnaturally, heroically run toward the fire. This week, among the many heroes, we have heard about these Fukushima 50, the nuclear power plant employees who stayed behind to prevent this total nuclear meltdown. And while we don't know very many specifics about these heroes, we have known them before. We have known them in the firefighters who ran up the Twin Towers. We have known them in those who stepped in front of bullets to take down a shooter In Tucson, we have known them in courageous protesters from the civil rights era to the modern Middle East. We don't know much about the Fukushima 50, but we know them. And I wonder how often it crossed their minds that their bodies were being poisoned. How often did they think of those 1,000 or so other employees who had been evacuated so that they would not be poisoned, so that they would not be exposed to the possible explosions and meltdowns? They probably were reminded of that every time they heard the click, click, click of a Geiger counter, or each time they looked into the face of a radiation-exposed colleague who had a child waiting at home for mom or dad, grandma or grandpa. So here's another why. Why have they done this? Why do some people run toward the fire, toward the radiation, toward the tear gas when everyone else is running away? When everyone else is remembering just how fragile flesh is, when everyone else is taking precautions to protect their own, why do some people give their flesh for the chance to save the lives of others? In my clergy group this week, the question came up, are these Fukushima 50 people of faith? Now, statistics on religion in Japan would predict that these employees, most of them, are probably not religious. But it's another question to ask, are they people of faith? Do they believe in something greater than themselves, greater than the flesh? They may not believe in Jesus or in heaven or hell, but it is clear to me that every hero believes in something that is more profound and more lasting than one human life. Are they people of faith? Today we were scheduled to read Psalm 121. And at first I thought that this was probably one of the most inappropriate psalms to read this week. It's I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from God, maker of heaven and earth. God will not let my foot be moved, and the sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. Yada, yada, yada. It's a psalm about how God will protect us from everything, even the sun and the moon. What a ridiculous thing to say this week. The very earth has opened up, people have died, and humanity has been handed our hat by the forces of nature. Where in the world was God's protection? But then I remembered where I'd heard this psalm before. Not at victory rallies or days of Thanksgiving, but I have heard this psalm before at funerals. This is a funeral psalm. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord. And as I read it again, I think it has the same meaning at a funeral that it has in that nuclear plant where 50 people at a time were exposing their fragile flesh to radiation to prevent nuclear disaster, where 50 people at a time were inexplicably running toward the fire when everyone else was running away. It means that there is a security and a safety that goes beyond the safety and security of our fleshly bodies. That somehow running into a fire can feel more secure than running away from it, when running in means that you are participating in something far more profound than one human life. This morning we also have one of the most famous passages in the entire Christian scriptures, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that God gave God's only Son, so that all who believe in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. And today, to me, this passage reminds us that God ran into a fire too. That God had one fleshly life, God's own Son, Jesus Christ, and the scriptures say that God ran into the fire. God gave that one life so that others would not perish, so that others would have life. And every day we see, not necessarily Christians, but Christ-like people running toward the fire, giving their lives so that others may not perish, so that others may have a better life. So Diamond Hill, would you do it? Would you go into that nuclear plant and expose yourself to that radiation and those explosions to help the people of your nation and your world? Would you be the hero? No, not all heroes are the kind that risk death to run into burning buildings to save babies and nations. I recently stumbled onto an online TED lecture by a New York City firefighter, a volunteer firefighter named Mark Brazos. And he told this story about a New York house fire. And he said that by the time he got to this house fire in New York, he was the second volunteer to arrive at the scene. And the professional firefighters had already doused most of the blaze. And the woman whose house it was standing outside barefoot, having probably just this awful, awful day. And the fire chief finally called over the first volunteer firefighter to the scene. And he said, I'm going to need you to go up through that smoldering house and save that woman's dog. Which of course was this very cool and heroic thing for him to do, to save the life of the beloved companion of this victim. So that firefighter went into the house. And then the fire chief turned to Mark, who waited expectantly for instructions to do something equally heroic. And the fire chief looked at him and said, Mark, I need you to do something very important. I need you to go through that smoldering house, and I need you to get that lady some shoes. And so Mark did that. And of course, as you might predict, the first volunteer firefighter's heroic act was far more appreciated than the second. But later in an interview, Mark remembers that woman saying how nice the firefighters were and that they even got her some shoes. But Mark's point was that every day, each of us has the chance to risk a little bit, to do something good for someone else. And it may not be as glorious as saving a quarter of the earth from nuclear radiation or running up a building in a daring rescue, but each of us has been given a life of flesh and blood. And each of us has been given free will to do with that life whatever we want to do. And we can give our lives working hopelessly to preserve that fleshly existence that we have, striving, struggling, troubling to make our flesh feel safe. Or, fragile in the flesh and secure in God alone, we can choose to give our lives every day to a higher purpose so that our sisters and brothers may not perish, but that they may have abundant life. May we choose faithfully. Amen.
Amen.